My name is Giorgia Auteri. I'm a PhD candidate at University of Michigan. I'm in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and I study bats for my PhD. My first experience with bats actually was as an intern, though, when I was interning at an environmental nonprofit. I was really interested at the time in environmental policy and management types of things. Getting people to help on these bat surveys they were doing. So I went out on some of those surveys, and I just thought it was so cool. Really fascinating to me that there was all these bats like flying around all over our heads at night that we don't know about, like we don't hear them or see them. And so that was like a really cool thing for me that got me hooked on them. Yeah, so I would say as a kid, I was definitely really interested in the outdoors and science. I remember being a kid in like 5th grade and waking up early every morning with my tape recorder to like go outside and record the bird calls. Because I don't know, I just thought that was cool. So I would say that I always loved nature, and I was always a real observer of nature and always really curious about nature. At the time, I would not have associated that as an interest in science. I think that, even as someone who has a dad who's a scientist, for some reason, there was some like inhibition there where it seemed like scientists were really smart, and like I didn't feel like I was really smart necessarily. But I think that it really took me a lot of time, not until after my undergraduate degree. My undergrad degree is not in a hard science program. It took me a lot of time to like come back around and realize that, oh, I actually could be a good scientist, and I'm a really curious person, and I really like being self-directed and answering my own questions and stuff like that. In my PhD program, I look at bats and how they're dealing with the disease white nose syndrome. So white nose syndrome is an invasive disease, a non-native disease that was brought to the United States by people. And the disease is caused by a fungus which infects the bats when they're trying to hibernate, and it's killed, over 95% of the cave hibernating bats in a lot of areas in the United States. And so for my PhD, I looked at whether the bats that survive this white nose syndrome disease, the few survivors, are genetically resistant to the disease, or if they were just lucky. They only survived because of luck or something like that. And that's a really important question for conservation, because, knowing whether or not the bats are adapting to be able to fend off the disease on their own is really important for like, allocating conservation resources over time and that type of planning. It's whether or not bats are evolving to white nose syndrome is also a really cool question just from an evolutionary standpoint. It's like we're seeing these cases of like rapid evolution and adaptation in species that are having to respond to human changes really quickly. And so it's cool to see that in action, although sad too, of course. So the first part of my PhD research found that the bats that survive white nose syndrome are actually genetically tolerant to the disease, to some degree at least. So they have, I mentioned previously that like the disease affects them while they're hibernating. It causes them to wake up too frequently from hibernation. And because they're waking up too frequently because of this fungus growing on them, they run out of fat reserves and energy too early. And I found that the survivors, if you compare their genetics to the bats that died, their survivors have differences in genes associated with fat metabolism, arousal from hibernation, and those types of things. So that was really interesting to see. It's, still too early to know whether that evolutionary advantage is strong enough for them to survive as a, population in the long run, as a species in the long run. But it's, promising first results. So, so after my PhD, I hope to keep doing research. I hope to become a professor someday, somewhere, and, keep asking the questions that inspire me, and, mentoring students and helping them figure out what questions inspire them and how to answer those questions. And so I think, having a career like that is really rewarding sounding to me. And I have a lot of questions, so. Probably the number one association that a lot of people have with scientists is that scientists are smart. And I will tell you right now, the world is full of a lot of smart people. And it's so much more than that. It's not about being like brilliant. It's about, being smart but also being creative and being curious about the world. A lot of people are really smart, but not that curious. They don't have questions. Being self-directed. As a scientist, I get to learn something new all the time, not just some new biological factoid, but I get to learn how to use a new computer program, or anything, like how to work with people and help convince them to go and find out about bats because it's cool. So you will get to do so many different things, a broad variety of things as a scientist. I think it's really rewarding. Yeah.